The college acceptance letter from Boston University felt like vindication in my hands, proof that I wasn't the academic failure my parents had spent 4 years telling me I was. I'd been accepted with a partial scholarship that would cover tuition, leaving approximately $18,000 annually for housing, fees, and living expenses. It was manageable with parental support, impossible without it. "Dad, I got into BU with a scholarship," I'd said during dinner, sliding the acceptance letter across the table toward where my father Richard sat reviewing financial documents. "I'll need help with room and board, but the scholarship covers most of..." No. He didn't even look up from the papers he was reviewing. "College is wasted on mediocre students like you. Alexis, you're not worth the investment." The words landed with the weight of a judge's verdict, final, absolute, destroying futures with casual certainty. I sat frozen, holding my fork, unable to process that my father had just told me I wasn't worth $18,000 annually while he drove a Mercedes and my mother wore jewelry worth more than a semester's housing. My younger sister Madison, 16 at the time, had smiled from across the table. A small, satisfied smile that suggested she'd known this was coming and had been waiting to watch it happen. Drop a comment if you've ever been told you weren't worth investing in by people who had the resources, but not the love. This story is about what happened when they needed something from me. My name is Alexis Brennan. I'm 32 years old, and I spent my teenage years being told I was mediocre, unremarkable, and undeserving of the kind of parental investment that successful children warranted. What my parents saw as an accurate assessment of my limited potential, I knew was the beginning of a competition I'd never agreed to enter, but that would define my entire relationship with my family. The Brennan family had always been about achievement, excellence, and measuring children's worth by test scores, awards, and the kind of visible success that parents could showcase at social gatherings. My father Richard was a finance executive earning $280,000 annually. My mother Diane had worked in marketing. Before becoming a full-time parent focused on optimizing her children's competitive advantages. They'd had specific expectations about what success looked like, and those expectations were shaped entirely by Madison's extraordinary performance throughout her childhood and adolescence. Madison was the golden child. Straight A's from elementary school forward, captain of the debate team, president of student council, national merit scholar, perfect SAT scores, early admission to Yale. Everything Madison touched seemed to succeed effortlessly, and my parents had interpreted her achievements as validation of their parenting approaches and proof that they'd created the optimal environment for developing exceptional children. Then there was me, the older daughter whose BU average, modest extracurriculars, and acceptance to Boston University with a partial scholarship represented what my parents viewed as comprehensive failure after years of investment in the same educational opportunities Madison had excelled with. "We gave you every advantage," my mother had said during the college discussion that followed my father's rejection of financial support. "Private tutors, test prep courses, music lessons, athletic programs. Madison thrived with those resources. Your inability to achieve at her level suggests you're simply not capable of justifying additional investment." The logic was brutal but consistent with how they'd been treating me since Madison's superiority had become undeniable around McDonald's. Diddle school. I had been competing against a sibling whose natural abilities and work ethic exceeded my own, and my parents had responded to that disparity by deciding I was the problem rather than recognizing that different children have different strengths and trajectories. "Madison is worth the investment, because she'll make the most of opportunities," Dad had continued during that dinner conversation. "You'd squander resources better directed toward your sister's future. It's just a practical allocation of family assets." Practical allocation of family assets. My father was describing his children like investment portfolios, calculating returns and deciding that I represented a bad investment unworthy of capital deployment. Share this if you've watched parents play favorites while pretending it was about merit. You need to hear what happened when their choices caught up with them. The contrast in how they treated Madison versus me had been stark and consistent throughout our adolescence. Madison's bedroom was redecorated twice to accommodate her evolving tastes and her collection of academic awards. My bedroom remained the same from age 12 onward because functional was sufficient. Madison received a new laptop every 2 years to ensure she had cutting-edge technology for her studies. I used hand-me-down computers and was told that upgraded equipment wouldn't improve my mediocre performance. When Madison expressed interest in studying abroad during high school, My parents had immediately arranged a summer program in France that cost $8,000. When I'd asked about attending a community college program to get ahead on general education credits, I'd been told it wasn't worth the expense given my academic trajectory. The favoritism had been visible enough that extended family had occasionally commented on it, but my parents had defended their allocation of resources as appropriate response to children's demonstrated capabilities, rather than acknowledging they were systematically undermining one daughter while lavishing attention and money on the other. We treat our children according to their needs and their ability to benefit from opportunities, Mom had explained to relatives who'd questioned why Madison received so much more support. It would be wasteful to give Alexis resources she can't utilize effectively. The rejection of college financial support had been the culmination of this pattern, but what made it truly devastating was discovering, through a conversation I accidentally overheard 2 weeks later, that my parents had already committed to funding Madison's entire Yale education, regardless of cost. Yale is estimating total costs at about $75,000 annually for tuition, room, board, everything. Dad had been telling someone on the phone, his voice carrying the pride that never colored conversations about me. Over 4 years, we're looking at $300,000, but Madison's worth every penny. She's going to be extraordinary. $300,000 for Madison's education. $0 for mine. The disparity wasn't about financial constraints. It was about their assessment of which daughter deserved investment, and which daughter was better off pursuing cheaper alternatives that matched her limited potential. I'd attended community college for 2 years, living at home and working overnight shifts at an Amazon warehouse to pay for tuition, books, and the expenses my parents refused to cover. The work had been exhausting. 11-hour shifts loading trucks, sleeping during the day, taking classes in the afternoon, studying whenever I could find time. But I'd completed my associate degree with a 3.8 GPA, transferred to University of Massachusetts Boston with a transfer scholarship, and finished my bachelor's degree in business administration while working full-time in retail management. Total cost of my 4-year degree, approximately $48,000, all of which I'd covered through work, scholarships, and modest student loans. Meanwhile, Madison had been living the fully funded college experience at Yale, studying abroad in 3 countries, joining exclusive clubs, networking with future leaders, and building exactly the kind of prestigious credentials my parents had anticipated when they decided she was worth $300,000 of dollars. Investment. The difference in our post-graduation trajectories had been immediate and visible. Madison had leveraged her Yale degree and network into an analyst position at Goldman Sachs, earning $110,000 straight out of college. My MS degree and retail management experience had gotten me an entry-level operations coordinator position at a small tech startup, earning $42,000. See? Madison's investment is already paying off, Dad had said during a family gathering where Madison was discussing her Goldman Sachs offer. Meanwhile, Alexis is working at some unknown startup nobody's heard of. That's exactly why we allocated resources the way we did. Comment allocated if you understand that the cruelest thing parents can do is treat love like a limited resource. Their choice was about to have consequences they never imagined. What my parents didn't know, what I deliberately kept from them because explaining would have required engaging with people who'd already decided I wasn't worth their attention, was that the unknown startup I joined was a logistics technology company called FlowChain that was developing AI-powered supply chain optimization software. I'd taken the entry-level position because the company's founder, Dr. Sarah Chen, had been impressed by my unusual combination of retail management experience and my undergraduate research project about supply chain and efficiency in e-commerce. She'd seen potential that my parents had never bothered looking for because they'd been too focused on Madison's conventional markers of success. Within 6 months at FlowChain, I'd been promoted to operations manager. After identifying inefficiencies in our client onboarding process and implementing solutions that reduced implementation time by 40%. Within 18 months, I'd become director of operations, overseeing a team of 12 people and managing relationships with our largest clients. By year 3, when FlowChain was acquired by a larger tech company for $85 million, I had been promoted to VP of operations with equity that translated to approximately $1.20 million after the acquisition closed. I'd used that windfall to invest in 3 other early-stage startups, serving as an advisor, and leveraging my operations expertise to help young companies avoid the inefficiencies that killed most tech ventures before they achieved profitability. One of those investments, a logistics platform called CargoLink that I'd taken an Operational leadership role had grown from 8 employees to 120 in 3 years, secured $30 million venture funding, and was now approaching $50 million annual revenue. My equity stake plus my role as chief operating officer meant I was earning $380,000 in salary, plus stock options worth approximately $8 million, if we achieved our projected valuation. But I'd never discussed any of this with my parents. They'd stopped asking about my career after the first year, apparently assuming that my work at the unknown startup represented exactly the kind of mediocre trajectory they'd predicted when refusing to fund my education. Madison's progression from Goldman Sachs to business school to a consulting position was the family's success story worth discussing, while my career was too unremarkable to warrant attention at family gatherings. The last time I'd seen my parents had been at Madison's wedding 2 years ago, where I'd been introduced to her Wall Street friends as Alexis, the sister who works in operations somewhere, while Madison was celebrated as the Wharton MBA. Was absolutely crushing it in management consulting. I'd smiled through the diminishment, congratulated Madison on her beautiful wedding, and left early because spending time with people who decided I wasn't worth knowing felt increasingly pointless as my actual career trajectory diverged further from their assumptions about my limited potential. What I'd learned over the subsequent 2 years was that Madison's absolutely crushing it consulting career was actually quite fragile, and my parents' own financial situation had deteriorated significantly due to poor investment choices and lifestyle maintenance that exceeded my father's stagnant income. Type fragile. If you're ready to hear about the interview that changed everything, this reversal was a decade in the making. The morning had been routine until my HR director, Patricia Morrison, had knocked on my office door with an unusual expression mixing professional discretion and barely suppressed excitement. "Alexis, I need to give you a heads up about your 2 p.m. interviews," Patricia had said, closing the door behind her and settling into the chair across from my desk. "We're interviewing for the senior finance manager and marketing director positions, and something's come up that you should probably know about before the candidates arrive." What kind of situation? I'd been reviewing quarterly projections and was only half focused on what should have been a routine hiring update. 2 of the candidates, the married couple applying for the separate positions, are named Richard Brennan and Diane Brennan. They listed their current address as being in Wellesley, and their work histories match what I'd expect for people in their late 50s who've had career setbacks and are looking to rebuild. The names had registered slowly, like a password. I'd forgotten entering that unlocked doors I'd deliberately closed. Richard and Diane Brennan. My parents. Applying for jobs at Cargolink. At my company. "Are you certain it's them?" My voice had come out steadier than I'd expected, professional instinct overriding the emotional chaos suddenly flooding my nervous system. I pulled their applications after I noticed the same last name and address. Richard Brennan, age 58, formerly VP of Finance at Meridian Capital until a layoff 18 months ago. Diane Brennan, age 56, formerly Senior Marketing Manager at Davidson Associates, position eliminated during restructuring 2 years ago. Photos on their LinkedIn profiles. They look like they could be your parents. They were my parents. Applying for senior positions at the logistics company where I was chief operating officer. The parents who'd told me I wasn't worth investing in were now asking my company to invest in them. "What do you, want me to do?" Patricia had asked gently, recognizing this was complicated beyond standard hiring protocol. I'd sat there processing the situation, calculating the professional and personal implications of what was about to happen. My parents didn't know I was COO of Cargolink. As far as they knew, I still worked in operations somewhere at some unremarkable company they'd never bothered asking about. They'd applied for positions without realizing they were asking for jobs from the daughter they'd dismissed as mediocre. Let the interviews proceed as scheduled, I decided after several minutes of consideration. Don't tell them I'm here or that I'm involved in the hiring process. Interview them professionally, assess their qualifications objectively, and we'll discuss next steps after you've completed the evaluations. You don't want to recuse yourself from the hiring decision? No. I want to see their applications, review their qualifications, and make an informed decision about whether they're the right fit for Cargolink. My personal history with them is separate from whether they can do the jobs they're applying for. Patricia had nodded, understanding that I was choosing to handle this professionally, even though the personal dynamics were extraordinary. She'd left me with copies of both applications, and I'd spent the next 2 hours before the interviews learning about my parents' professional lives, in ways I'd never bothered to before because they'd never been interested in mine. Richard Brennan's resume revealed that his finance career had peaked about 8 years ago as VP of Finance at a mid-size investment firm. He'd been laid off 18 months ago during industry restructuring, and since then had been consulting sporadically, while apparently searching for permanent positions that would restore the income and status he'd lost. Diane Brennan's resume showed a marketing career that had been solid but unspectacular, culminating in a senior marketing manager position that had been eliminated during company downsizing 2 years ago. Her subsequent applications appeared to be targeting any marketing leadership role that would provide income and stability. Both applications carried the slight desperation that characterized resumes from people in their late 50s who'd lost positions and were discovering that age discrimination and changing industries made finding equivalent work extraordinarily difficult. They were qualified for the positions they were applying for, but they were also clearly candidates who needed these jobs rather than having multiple attractive options. At 1:55 p.m., Patricia had returned to my office. "They've arrived. They're in the lobby. Are you sure you want to proceed this way?" I'd been sure. Conduct the interviews as you would with any senior candidates. Ask standard questions, assess cultural fit, evaluate their qualifications objectively. I'll review your notes afterward and we'll make decisions based on what's best for CargoLink. What I didn't tell Patricia was that I'd be observing the interviews remotely through the video system we'd installed in conference rooms for Ode hiring, a system that allowed me to watch the proceedings without being visible to candidates. Drop observing if you believe the most powerful position is sometimes being invisible. I was about to learn more about my parents than 10 years of family gatherings had revealed. I'd watched both interviews from my office, video feeds showing my parents as they'd answered Patricia's questions with the kind of polished professionalism that comes from decades of corporate experience, but that couldn't completely mask the underlying anxiety that characterized people who needed these positions to work out. Richard had interviewed first, discussing his finance background with competence but notable lack of enthusiasm. He described his previous roles accurately, explained his layoff as industry restructuring beyond his control, and answered technical questions about financial management and reporting with solid expertise. But what had struck me most was how diminished he seemed, not the confident finance executive who'd told me I wasn't worth investing in, but someone whose professional identity had been shaken by prolonged unemployment and whose answers a defensive undertone suggesting he was worried about being judged as too old or too expensive, or too out of touch with current practices. Why CargoLink? Patricia had asked the standard question about candidate motivation. I need a stable position with a growing company, Richard had answered honestly. My previous role ended during restructuring and I've been consulting while searching for the right permanent opportunity. CargoLink's growth trajectory and the logistics technology sector seem promising for rebuilding my career in my final working years. My father acknowledged that at 58, he was approaching the end of his career rather than the peak of his earning potential. The man who'd dismissed my potential so casually was now worried about his own diminishing prospects. Diane's interview had followed a similar pattern: competent discussion of marketing experience, honest acknowledgement of job loss and difficult job search, and answers that revealed someone who was professionally capable but personally deflated by how the past 2 years had undermined her confidence and stability. The marketing landscape has changed dramatically, Diane had explained when Patricia asked about the gap in her employment. Digital marketing, social media, influencer partnerships, I've been taking in courses to update my skills, but it's challenging to compete with candidates who are younger and cheaper and have been doing this work natively. She'd looked tired as she said it, not physically, but emotionally tired in the way people get it when they've been fighting uphill battles for too long without success. Both interviews had been professionally adequate. My parents were qualified for the positions they'd applied for. Their experience was relevant, their skills were appropriate, and under normal circumstances they'd have been strong candidates worth considering seriously. But these weren't normal circumstances. These were the people who'd told me I wasn't worth $18,000 annually for college housing, while spending $300,000 on Madison's education. These were the parents who'd dismissed my career as unremarkable without ever asking what I actually did. These were the people whose assessment of my worth had been so devastating that I'd spent 10 years proving them wrong while avoiding any contact that would expose me to their continued judgment. Patricia had returned to my office after both interviews concluded, settling into her chair with an expression I couldn't quite read. "They're qualified," she'd said without preamble, Richard could handle the senior finance manager role effectively, and Diane has solid marketing experience that would translate well to our needs. Under normal circumstances, I'd recommend bringing both of them back for second interviews with the executive team. But they're your parents, and I can't assess this situation objectively without understanding how you want to handle it. This isn't just about whether they can do the jobs, it's about whether you want them working here, whether their presence would affect your ability to lead effectively, and whether we're prepared to manage the family dynamics that would inevitably complicate everything. I nodded, appreciating her direct assessment of complications that transcended standard hiring considerations. If I recuse myself completely and you make the hiring decisions independently, would you move forward with them? Patricia had considered carefully before answering. Richard would be a solid hire for the finance role, experienced, capable, and reliable. Diane is qualified for the marketing position, though we have younger candidates with more current digital expertise who might be better long-term fits. If I didn't know they were your parents, I'd probably bring Richard back for a second interview and pass on Diane in favor of candidates with more relevant recent experience. The professional assessment was clear. My father was a strong candidate worth considering seriously. My mother was adequate but not the best available option. Standard hiring protocol would mean offering Richard a second interview while moving forward with other candidates for the marketing position. But this wasn't standard hiring protocol. This was my parents applying for jobs at my company without knowing who they'd be working for, creating a situation that would force them to confront exactly how wrong they'd been about my trajectory and my worth. Comment confronting. If you believe the most powerful lessons are the ones people teach themselves, my decision would determine what my parents would learn. I'd asked Patricia for 24 hours to make a final decision, and I'd spent that evening at home wrestling with professional responsibility, personal history, and the question of what I actually wanted from this impossible situation. Option 1. Hire neither of them, denying them positions they needed without revealing my role in the decision. They'd never know they'd applied to my company or that their dismissed daughter had been evaluating their qualifications. Option 2. Hire one or both based purely on professional merit, revealing my position only after they'd accepted offers and arrived for their first day. Maximum dramatic impact, but potentially destructive to their dignity and our working relationship. Option 3. Reveal my role before making hiring decisions, giving them the opportunity to withdraw their applications if they couldn't handle working for the daughter they dismissed as not worth investing in. Each option carried different implications for professional integrity, personal satisfaction, and the possibility of any kind of family reconciliation or accountability. I'd called my sister Madison for the first time in 8 months, needing to understand the family's current situation before making decisions that would affect all of them. Alexis? Madison had sounded surprised to hear from me. Is everything okay? Mom and Dad applied for jobs at my company. Did you know they were job hunting? Silence on the line, then a heavy sigh. They've been struggling since Dad got laid off. He's been unemployed for 18 months, Mom's been out of work for over 2 years, and they've been burning through savings trying to maintain their lifestyle. I've been helping financially when I can, but my consulting salary isn't enough to support them and handle my own expenses. This was information our parents had apparently kept from me entirely, not surprising given we'd barely been in contact, but revealing about how much their financial situation had deteriorated. How bad is it? Bad enough that they're going to have to sell the house if they don't find stable income soon? Dad's unemployment benefits ran out months ago, and their retirement accounts have been depleted covering living expenses. They're basically starting over financially at 58 and 56, which is terrifying at their age. The house they'd be selling was the one I'd grown up in. The house where they told me I wasn't worth investing in while writing checks for Madison's education. There was poetic justice in them losing it, due to financial decisions that mirrored their choice to invest everything in Madison while dismissing me entirely. Did they tell you they're applying to my company specifically? They don't know it's your company, Alexis? As far as they know, you're still working in operations at some startup they've never heard of. They have no idea you're coup of Cargolink or that you're the one who'll be deciding whether to hire them. The confirmation that they'd remained willfully ignorant about my career made the situation more complex. They'd been so convinced I was mediocre that they'd never bothered updating their understanding of my actual trajectory even as their own situations had declined. Madison, do they ever ask about me? Do they wonder whether their assessment of my worth was accurate? Another pause, longer this time. Alexis, I don't think they have the emotional capacity to question their own judgment right now. They're struggling to keep their heads above water financially and psychologically. Acknowledging they were wrong about you would require confronting that their entire framework for measuring success and allocating resources was flawed. I don't think they can handle that realization given everything else that's falling apart. We'd talked for another hour, with Madison filling in details about our parents' financial decline, the stress it was creating, and her own complicated feelings about having been the favored child whose expensive education was now generating income that barely covered her own needs, much less theirs. I feel guilty, Madison had admitted near the end of our conversation. They invested $300,000 in my education, and I'm making $145,000 in consulting, which is good but not enough to support them. Meanwhile, they refuse to invest in your education, and you're apparently doing well enough to be in a position to hire them, The irony is pretty brutal. The irony was indeed brutal, but it also represented exactly the kind of natural consequences that result from making investment decisions based on assumptions about potential rather than actual demonstrated character and work ethic. By the time we'd ended the call, I'd made my decision about how to handle the situation. Type decision: if you're ready to hear what I chose, this moment would define relationships for years to come. The following morning, I had called Patricia into my office to explain my decision. I want to proceed with Richard's interview process. Bring him back for a second interview with department heads, evaluate him objectively, and if everyone agrees he's the right fit, extend an offer. But before he accepts, I want to meet with him personally to disclose my role in the company and give him the opportunity to decline if he can't work for me. And Diane, pass on her application in favor of candidates with stronger digitata marketing backgrounds. If she were the clearly superior candidate, I'd consider proceeding, but since she's not, I'm going to remove the family complications by hiring someone else for that role. Patricia nodded. That's probably the cleanest solution professionally. What about after Richard learns your coup? What if he accepts the position anyway? Then we'll have to figure out how to manage the family dynamics as they emerge. But I want to give him the choice rather than ambushing him on his first day with information that might make him feel humiliated or trapped. The second interview had proceeded 2 days later, with Richard meeting the CFO, the Director of Finance, and several members of the finance team. By all accounts, he'd performed well, demonstrating technical competence, asking intelligent questions about Cargolink's financial systems and growth trajectory, and making a generally positive impression on everyone who'd interviewed him. Everyone's on board with hiring him, Patricia had reported after the second interview concluded. The CFO thinks he'd be an asset to the team, and the finance director is excited about having someone with his level of experience. From a professional standpoint, this is a solid hire. Then let's extend a verbal offer contingent on successful background check and references. But schedule a meeting with me before he gives his final acceptance. Tell him the coup wants to meet with senior hires personally as part of our company culture. 3 days later, my father had arrived at Cargolink for what he believed was a final meeting with a coup he'd never heard of before accepting a position that would restore some of his lost financial stability and professional identity. Patricia had escorted him to my office, and I'd watched through the glass wall as he'd walked down the hallway, with the slightly nervous confidence of someone who thinks they've successfully navigated a hiring process, and is now meeting a F&L executive. As a formality before starting work, Patricia had knocked once, opened my door, and said clearly, "Alexis, Richard Brennan is here for your meeting." I'd watched my father's expression change as he'd processed what Patricia had just said. Alexis, his daughter's name. Coming from my office. The office he'd been told belonged to Cargolink's CEO. He'd frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror as he'd understood that the CEO he'd been scheduled to meet was the daughter he'd told wasn't worth investing in 10 years ago. "Hello, Dad," I'd said from behind my desk, keeping my voice professionally neutral. "Please come in and have a seat. We need to discuss your employment offer." Drop. Frozen if you've ever watched someone realize their assumptions were completely wrong. This moment was a decade of reckoning compressed into seconds. My father had entered my office moving like someone in a dream, settling into the chair across from my desk while his eyes took in the details that confirmed this wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. The nameplate reading Alexis Brennan, CC. Chief Operating Officer, the diplomas on the wall documenting my UMass degree and professional certifications, the photos showing me with Cargolink's leadership team and major clients. "Alexis, I didn't know," His voice had trailed off as he'd struggled to find words for a situation he'd never imagined encountering. You didn't know because you never asked, I'd said calmly. For 10 years you've assumed I was working in operations somewhere at some unremarkable company. You never inquired about what I actually did, what company I worked for, or how my career had developed. You decided I was mediocre when I was 18, and you never updated that assessment despite having no information about my actual trajectory. He'd sat silent, unable to deny the accuracy of what I was saying. I'm Cargolink's Chief Operating Officer. I've held this position for 3 years after serving as VP of Operations and Director of Operations at previous companies. My career in logistics and operations management has been quite successful, despite your assessment that I wasn't worth investing in. We didn't realize, he'd started, then stopped, recognizing that explaining his ignorance wasn't actually a defense. You didn't realize because you didn't care enough to find out. Now you're sitting in my office because you've applied for a position at my company, and I need to decide whether to hire you. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The father who dismissed my worth was now hoping to be judged worthy by the daughter he determined wasn't worth $18,000 in college support. From a professional standpoint, you're qualified for the senior finance manager role, I'd continued, keeping my tone businesslike. Your experience is relevant, your skills match our needs, and the team that interviewed you believes you'd be an asset. Under normal circumstances, I'd approve hiring you, without hesitation. But these aren't normal circumstances, he'd said quietly, beginning to understand the complexity of what was happening. No, they're not. These are circumstances where the daughter you told wasn't worth investing in is now in a position to invest in you, to provide the stable employment and income you need at a point in your life when options are limited and financial security has become precarious. I'd paused, letting him process the reversal before continuing. I'm not going to reject your application because of our personal history. The position is yours if you want it, at the salary we discussed with Patricia, with standard benefits and the opportunity to rebuild your career during your final working years. Relief had flooded his face. The position represented a lifeline he desperately needed. But I need you to understand something before you accept, I'd added, my voice carrying the weight of 10 years of dismissed worth and unexamined assumptions. If you work here, you work for me. I'm your ultimate supervisor as CEO. Your performance, your compensation, your future with this company, all of that flows through my assessment of your value and contribution. The implication was unmistakable. He'd be asking the daughter he deemed worthless to judge whether he was worth keeping employed. I can handle that, he'd said, though his voice had been uncertain. Can you? Can you really work for the daughter whose potential you dismissed so completely that you refused to invest $18,000 annually in her education while spending $300,000 on Madison's? Can you accept that your assessment of my worth was wrong, and that I'm now in a position to assess your worth? He'd met my eyes finally, and I'd seen something there I'd never seen before, shame mixed with recognition that his daughter had every right to feel satisfaction about this reversal. You've earned this position, Alexis. Whatever I thought about your potential when you were 18, you've proven that I was wrong. You've built something impressive and I don't know what to say except that I'm sorry I never saw it. The apology wasn't adequate for 10 years of dismissal, but it was the first acknowledgement I'd ever received that their assessment had been flawed. Comment acknowledge if you believe the most powerful apologies are the ones circumstances force rather than conscience motivates. This recognition came from necessity, not insight. We'd talked for another 40 minutes, the longest honest conversation we'd had in 10 years. My father had explained the financial decline that had brought him to applying for positions at companies he knew nothing about, the layoff that had ended his finance career, and how age discrimination had made finding equivalent work nearly impossible, the slow erosion of savings and confidence that had brought him to Cargolink seeking employment. I'd explained my career trajectory in detail he'd never asked for, the early-stage startup that had been acquired, profitably the investments I'd made and advisory roles I'd taken that had positioned me for the COO role at Cargolink, the growth we'd achieved, and the equity stake that meant my net worth now exceeded what he and Mom had accumulated over their entire careers. You've done extraordinarily well, he'd said when I'd finished explaining. Better than I could have imagined when you were 18. I was wrong about your potential, and I cost you years of educational opportunity and family support because I was too focused on Madison's success to recognize that you might succeed differently. You cost me more than educational opportunity, Dad. You cost me the belief that my parents valued me and thought I was worth investing in. You cost me the kind of family support that makes people feel secure and loved regardless of their achievements. You measured my worth entirely by comparison to Madison, and when I didn't measure up, you decided I wasn't worth your resources or attention. He'd nodded slowly, accepting the assessment because denying it was impossible given where we re-sitting and how we'd arrived there. If I accept this position, what happens to our relationship outside of work? The question was fair and important. Hiring him created professional obligations that were separate from family dynamics, but those spheres would inevitably overlap in complicated ways. I don't know, I'd answered honestly. I haven't had a meaningful relationship with you or Mom for 10 years because being dismissed and undervalued was too painful to continue engaging with. Working together might create opportunities for rebuilding something, or it might make the distance more obvious and permanent. We'll have to figure it out as we go. Does your mother know about your role here? Mom's application for the marketing position was declined in favor of candidates with stronger digital expertise. Patricia sent a standard rejection email yesterday. As far as I know, Mom has no idea that Cargolink is my company, or that you've been interviewing to work for your daughter. Should I tell her? That's your choice. But if you accept this position, she'll find out eventually, either because you tell her, or because you slip up and mention something about work, or because she sees company materials with my name and title. The question is whether you want to control how and when she learns that her dismissed daughter is now in a position to employ her. He'd been quiet for a long moment. I'll tell her tonight. She deserves to know before I accept, and we need to have honest conversations about how wrong we were about you, and what that means for our family going forward. I'd extended my hand across the desk. Then welcome to Cargolink, Dad. You start Monday. Patricia will send the formal offer letter and onboarding materials this afternoon. He'd shaken my hand, the gesture feeling surreal, a professional acknowledgement of an employment relationship between father and daughter that existed because I'd succeeded despite rather than because of his support. After he'd left, I'd sat alone in my office processing what had just happened. I'd hired my father to work at my company. The man who'd told me I wasn't worth investing in would now receive paychecks that I ultimately authorized. The parent who'd dismissed my potential would now report to the daughter whose success he'd never anticipated or acknowledged. The satisfaction felt complicated, vindication mixed with sadness that it had taken financial desperation to force recognition I'd deserved all along. Share if you believe the most powerful victories are the ones where you have to watch the defeated person understand exactly what they lost. This wasn't triumph, it was reckoning. My father had started at Cargolink the following Monday, and the first few weeks had been professionally awkward but manageable. He'd performed his job competently, interfaced appropriately with colleagues, and maintained professional boundaries that kept personal history separate from workplace interactions. But the real transformation had come during his first month, when he'd attended the quarterly all-hands meeting where I'd presented Cargolink's growth trajectory, strategic initiatives, and the vision that had guided our expansion from 80 employees to 120 in 3 years. I'd watched him watching me present, seeing for the first time how I operated in my leadership role, how the team responded to my direction, how the team responded. Strategic decisions I'd made had positioned the company for continued growth. His expression had cycled through surprise, respect, and something that looked like belated recognition that his daughter possessed exactly the kind of capability he'd decided she lacked when she was 18. After the meeting, several colleagues had approached him to comment on how impressive it was to work for someone as young and accomplished as I was. One of the finance team members had mentioned that I was considered a rising star in logistics technology, and that working for me was viewed as a career accelerator for people looking to advance in the industry. My father had listened to these assessments of my professional reputation with visible discomfort, not because they were wrong, but because they contradicted so completely the narrative he'd maintained about me for over a decade. The breaking point had come 6 weeks into his employment, during a one-on-one meeting where we'd been reviewing his performance and discussing his integration into the team. The conversation had been professional until he'd asked a question that moved us beyond workplace discussion into territory we'd been avoiding. "Alexis, can I ask you something personal?" I hesitated, then nodded. "As long as you understand that this is a conversation between family members, not supervisor and employee, when did you stop needing our approval? When did you decide that proving us wrong mattered less than building something for yourself?" The question revealed That he'd been processing more than just the employment reversal. He'd been examining the decade of our relationship and recognizing patterns he'd never noticed when he'd been the one with power. "I stopped needing your approval the day you told me I wasn't worth investing in," I'd answered honestly. "That was the day I understood that your love was conditional on achievement you recognized, and that if I wanted to build anything meaningful, it would have to be on my own terms without waiting for validation that was never going to come. But you never told us about your success. You let us continue thinking you were working at some unknown startup doing unremarkable work. Why didn't you correct our assumptions?" "Because correcting them would have required engaging with people who'd already decided I wasn't worth knowing. You'd made your assessment of my worth when I was 18, and you never showed any interest in updating that understanding even as years passed and circumstances changed. Why should I have volunteered information to people who hadn't bothered asking?" He'd had no answer for that, because the truth was that his lack of interest in my actual life had been absolute and sustained. "I cost you more than money, didn't I? It cost you the kind of relationship where parents celebrate their children's successes regardless of how those successes compare to siblings. You cost me the belief that my parents loved me unconditionally. You taught me that love in our family was a limited resource allocated based on perceived return on investment, and that I'd been evaluated and found unworthy of that investment. Type unconditional if you believe the cruelest lessons parent teach are about the limits of their love. This understanding has shaped everything." We continued meeting periodically over the following months, conversations that were part therapy, part accountability, and part tentative reconstruction of a relationship that had been broken for so long neither of us remembered what it had looked like when it was intact. My father had started attending family therapy with my mother, sessions focused on examining their parenting choices and the favoritism that had damaged both daughters even though it had manifested differently. Madison joined these sessions occasionally, processing her own complicated feelings about having been the favored child and the guilt that came with recognizing the damage their investment disparity had caused. "I used to resent how much they gave Madison," I told them during one joint session. "But I've come to understand that the money wasn't the real injury. The real injury was the message that money communicated, that Madison was worth investing in because she demonstrated potential they valued, and I wasn't worth investing in because I didn't meet their metrics for success." Mom had cried during that session, genuine tears that suggested she was finally understanding what her allocation of resources had actually communicated to both daughters. "I thought we were being practical," she'd said. "I thought we were directing limited resources toward the child who would benefit most. I didn't understand that we were telling you that your worth as our daughter was contingent on achieving in ways we recognized and valued. But your resources weren't limited, Mom. You spent $300,000 on Madison's education, while refusing me $18,000 annually. That wasn't scarcity, that was a choice. You chose to invest everything in her while telling me I wasn't worth investment." The sessions had been painful but necessary, forcing my parents to confront how their parenting had damaged me, while also examining how it had affected Madison, who'd internalized pressure to succeed because failure would mean wasting the massive investment they'd made in her potential. "I've been terrified of disappointing them my entire life," Madison had admitted during one session. "They invested so much in me that anything less than extraordinary success feels like betraying their faith." Meanwhile, Alexis got to build her career without that pressure because they'd already written her off. The irony was brutal. Madison had been burdened by excessive investment and expectations, thing without the weight of parental pressure and comparison. A year after my father had started at Cargolink, we'd had dinner together as a family for the first time in over a decade, all four of us at a restaurant, navigating conversations that were still awkward but that represented genuine effort to rebuild relationships that had been broken by choices none of us could undo. "I need to tell you something," my father had said during dessert, his voice carrying the weight of something he'd been preparing to say. "Your mother and I are selling the house. We're downsizing to something we can maintain on my salary and her consulting income without burning through the remainder of our savings." The house sale represented the final dissolution of the lifestyle they'd maintained throughout our childhood, the visible marker of success and stability that was no longer sustainable given their changed circumstances. "We wanted you both to know because there are items in the house that might have sentimental value, family photos, your childhood belongings, things we've kept but that you might want before we move." Madison had nodded, already making plans to visit and sort through memories. But I'd felt more detached. The house had never felt like home after I'd learned I wasn't worth investing in, and the items stored there represented a childhood I'd spent being compared unfavorably to my sister. There's also something else, Mom had added, exchanging a look with Dad that suggested they'd discussed this beforehand. We've established a trust fund for any children you or Madison might have someday. Not a large one. We can't afford what we spent on Madison's education, but enough to ensure that our grandchildren have educational support, regardless of which daughter they're born to. The gesture was clearly intended as partial restitution, an acknowledgement that their allocation of resources had been wrong, and an attempt to ensure the next generation didn't experience the same disparity. We can't undo what we did to you, Alexis, Dad had said. We can't give you back the college experience we funded for Madison, or the security of knowing your parents believed in you, or the years of relationship we lost, because we were too focused on visible achievement to recognize your actually potential. But we can try to do better going forward and make sure we don't repeat those failures with our grandchildren. Comment grandchildren if you believe the best parents learn from their mistakes even when learning comes too late to help their own children. This acknowledgement mattered even though it couldn't restore what was lost. 3 years after my father started at Cargolink, our relationship had evolved into something neither warm nor hostile. Professional respect mixed with cautious family connection, regular contact without deep intimacy, acknowledgement of past damage without pretending it could be fully repaired. My father had proven to be a valuable employee. His finance expertise contributed to Cargolink's continued growth, and his work ethic and reliability made him someone the team appreciated having around. He'd been promoted to finance director after 2 years, a recognition of his capabilities that was independent of our family relationship. My mother had found consulting work helping small businesses with marketing strategy, earning modest but stable income that combined with Dad's salary to provide the financial security they'd lost during their unemployment periods. They'd sold the big house and moved to a smaller home that was comfortable, but lacked the prestige of their previous lifestyle. Madison's consulting career had continued successfully, and she'd started her own boutique consulting firm specializing in operations improvement, expertise I'd helped her develop through conversations about my own work and introductions to my professional network. The irony of Madison now working in operations consulting wasn't lost on either of us. Most significantly, my parents had started volunteering with organizations that helped first-generation college students navigate higher education, using their professional expertise to support students whose families couldn't provide the kind of financial and strategic support they'd given Madison but denied me. I can't fix what I did to you, Dad had told me during one of our quarterly check-ins. But I can help other parents understand that dismissing a child's potential based on limited metrics is devastating, and that kids who don't fit conventional success patterns deserve support and investment just as much as the ones who excel in ways parents recognize. The volunteer work didn't absolve them of their parenting failures, but it represented genuine effort to ensure other families didn't replicate the damage they'd caused through their favoritism and their narrow definition of worth. For my part, I'd established a scholarship fund specifically for students whose families had limited resources or who were pursuing education without parental financial support. Students who faced the same barriers I'd navigated when community college and work study became my only options for achieving education. My parents deemed me unworthy of receiving. The scholarship wasn't large by elite standards, $10,000 annually for 10 students, covering community college tuition or supplementing university costs for students working their way through school. But it represented my recognition that the students most worth investing in are often the ones fighting hardest with the least support. Tell me about a time when people who dismissed you had to confront evidence of their misjudgment, or when you had to decide whether to help someone who'd refused to help you. How did you navigate the power reversal? And what would you say to someone whose family measured their worth by metrics that didn't capture their actual potential?